Welcome to China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. This is Jacob Gunter, the Chamber's Senior Policy and Communications Manager. This episode is a recording of our Summer 2020 VIP webinar series, which featured government, business, and thought leaders from around the world having frank discussions on tough topics with Chamber President Joerg Wuttke. If you're tired of long speeches and looking for lots of back and forth, you've come to the right place. If you enjoy the conversation, have a look at our website and sign up for future webinars so you can enjoy them live and even ask questions of our speakers. Without further ado, let's jump right into the topic. China's political and economic prospects.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our birthday party. As you know, the Chamber turns 20. And we have organized a round of 8 seminars, webinars. Of course, the number had to be 8. We're very happy that we could line up a couple of very good experts, but also, frankly, friends of the Chamber. We started off on politics. Today, again, you will hear something on politics. But we had a more European and inside China view last week. And now we get the view from Washington and the view from Singapore. Chris Johnson will dial in a second. I have already my friend David on the line. He is an old China hand based in Beijing and Singapore. He's heading the conference board. Asia Pacific Senior Vice President, and I really appreciate that you make yourself available, David. Now, if I just outlined the concept of this series, the concept of this series is not to have these overstuffed panels, just 1 or 2 people addressing issues that we can have a real discussion going on. I will chip questions right away, no presentation, no PowerPoint. And we will then basically get into a discussion, and our lead pen, Jacob, will monitor the questions that you will raise. And if they fit the narrative, he will raise his hand and basically chip in your question. So we have 90 exciting minutes ahead of us. Let's get going. Of course, question number 1, David, would be the National People's Congress starting next week. It will open, of course, we know that it opened late because of the coronavirus, but it seems to be really opening up very late. Is there any thoughts behind it, and how do you think it will be conducted? Fully staffed, virtual, whatever? And of course, the question most members might have is, what kind of topics will you see will pop out of this NPC?
Yeah, well, you know, whether it will be staffed in person or in part virtual or a hybrid, I think I really have no idea. And it remains to be seen. I don't think it would necessarily be seen as a weakness either domestically or internationally for the Congress to convene virtually or in hybrid fashion. So I don't think the pressure is so high on the leadership to demonstrate you know, the end of the virus by appearing in person in a way that, you know, might subject them to health hazard. It's very clear, I think, to just about everybody, maybe not entirely so domestically in China, that, you know, the virus risks remain, even if China has managed, we hope, to contain it domestically. The risks of reopening trade routes and things presents an omnipresent threat that I think we all now agree will be with us for some time. I mean, what I'm thinking about with respect to this Congress is what we'll see in terms of the government stimulus response to the economic damage that has occurred. Our assessment is that the economic damage has been very significant. We know that China reported its first quarter of negative growth in Q1 since the quarterly series was started in 1991. And our expectation is that growth this year will come in, at around -2%. Whether the official data will reveal that or not remains to be seen. That assessment could change depending on the size of the fiscal effort that China applies to cushioning economic damage or reviving growth. There have been figures thrown around that are in the 7 trillion RMB range. That would be a big package for infrastructure spending, both on traditional and on what is being called new infrastructure. So 5G networks, cloud computing centers, and STEM labs and so forth. And the specifics of this have not been revealed. So, monetary measures are pretty much the same anywhere you go. They can be more or less and use different levers, but there's only a certain set of levers available on the monetary side. On the fiscal side, governments around the world can do very different things. And we expect that China will focus quite a lot on the supply side, on the infrastructure side. What we're curious to see is whether we see anything around more direct support for private enterprise, for small business, either with payroll support or direct subsidies, whether we see any funds channeled to the households, like we've seen in the United States with essential, basic income provisions to help households through, the tough patch. Those would be very unconventional for China, but, maybe we'll see them. And the thing that's really top of my mind is what we'll hear from the provinces. I mean, what is remarkable to me, and maybe this group is experiencing something different, but the information on what is happening at the local level, across Chinese cities and provinces has become incredibly limited. I mean, how bad is the bankruptcy situation? How bad is the unemployment situation? How stressed are city finances? I mean, we know that cities depend, hugely on value-added tax and land sales for their fiscal revenues. Both of those have got to be hugely down. And so what we're really looking for is what we hear from the provincial reports. Whether we hear from them at all, we think will be telling. Typically one is able to obtain some degree of reporting on the provincial side, and we'll be curious to see whether it happens this time around or whether it's sort of just about high level celebration of China's success vis-a-vis virus containment and the announcement of big new fiscal measures on sort of standard infrastructure spending.
David, we have Chris now on the line. He's dialing in from DC. So welcome, Chris, and good evening to you. Maybe we really just start off with the NPC. Besides the coronavirus delay, was there another reason to put it so late in May? And what do you expect will be the outcome of it? What do you expect are the areas where we have to pay attention?
Sure. And apologies that I didn't hear all of what David had to say, so I hope I don't repeat. Basically, I think the reason is pretty much coronavirus, although I think it's also fair to say, and I heard from a couple of my contacts, that they were also, there was also a pretty strong desire amongst the leadership to push the meeting as deep into Q2 as they could without, pushing it too far where people were beginning to wonder, would this thing ever happen? And that was largely because, all the way back in sort of, I would say, middle of March, my sense is they had the numbers for Q1, they knew they were completely dismal. And then it was throw everything into Q2, see if work resumption and could, boost, the sort of capacity utilization numbers for firms, see if the various voucher and other stimulus programs could work. And I think there was just basically always a tension between the desire, very strong desire to signal the world normalcy, and the NPC is a return to normalcy officially, and this desire to kind of get as much information as they could before they might have to declare a growth target. I don't know about today. I know that last week there was no consensus still on what the growth target would or should be. And that's obviously very unusual. Usually that's scripted out at the Central Economic Work Conference in December, and that didn't happen this year. And as David was just saying, I think there's still some pretty active debate about what type, not only how much stimulus, but what types. Some scholars who I think are reflecting ongoing debates, and the people who write the Premier's work report are talking about, this is not a typical financial crisis or slowdown. This is an economic aneurysm. And therefore, building a lot of bridges to nowhere and so on may not do the job. We may have to get direct support to individuals and SMEs, as David had said, and particularly private sector ones.
I mean, the fact that they haven't really made up their mind, at least as far as we know, about the growth rate, could it be that they will come up with a range? Could it be around 2%? I mean, yesterday, HSBC, which is always following the line of the Communist Party when it comes to data, came up with 1.7%. They were one of the last, unlike UBS, Wang Tao, who already indicated less than 2% 4 weeks ago. Would there be a range that coming out, or would they drop a target totally and just really emphasize poverty alleviation and the kind of healthcare system in order to draw away the attention from this kind of figures?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of stuff stirring in that cauldron. One of them is, it was sort of like the Q1 contraction figure, right? I think they knew that to be credible, it had to be at least the consensus view of -6. So they did what they do, which is to go a little bit lower than that. I think, most people would say that a fair number would be in the low double digits, for the contraction. And I think they know that. I think this is a similar dilemma. Can we announce a growth target of 1.5%? Why bother? It doesn't look good from, sort of their system. I mean, the interesting piece to me in this is, it's my understanding that since the third plenum, Liu He has been arguing every year for there to be no growth target. He always loses, and he knows he's going to lose. I think it helps him restrain some of the instincts of certain more, profligate elements in the system who would always like to have the target be higher. So I don't think we'll see no target. The range is a smart idea because it gives them some flexibility. The worst thing they can do is set an ambitious target. I mean, they can't go above 3% because that would just be laughable. And, set an ambitious target and miss. That would be very, very negative. So it strikes me, this idea of the 2-year range or a cumulative target of, say, 5% between this year and 2021 gives them a lot more options and helps them, try their best. I think we're seeing some out of the PBOC's Q1 monetary report. We're seeing now more loosening, but they've tried really hard to be pretty judicious, especially in comparison with pretty much every Western government.
I mean, if they come out with a low growth digit this year, of course, the base is going to be so low that next year we have possibly between 7 and 10% GDP growth, which might be very neat for the anniversary of the Communist Party of 100 years to come up with a strong data set. David, you mentioned the continent China, the kind of difference in how to challenge they are with the virus. Which areas are you seeing most lagging behind hitting recession, and which provinces or which parts of China do you see are possibly coming back much stronger?
Well, we did a big study in 2016 and 2017 called No More Tears, where we looked at we unpacked this idea that the lower tier cities in China was where all the growth was. And that seems suspicious to us, but we undertook this study, and what we discovered was that of China's sort of 600 plus tier 4 prefectural cities and above, there were really only about 40 cities that had genuine balanced economic dynamics, and another sort of 49 cities that clustered around them, attached to them in some ways, and that by and large, most cities had very unbalanced growth composites. And that as the economy slowed, the cities that were too reliant on one big SOE or one big upstream industrial sector, or had too excessively overbuilt their real estate markets, typically all three, would really suffer when economic growth really began to slow. So I think, Joerg, you know our thesis. We think China is amidst, before this crisis, was amidst a deep structural downshift caused by a productivity challenge. And so this will have exacerbated this. And the cities were already struggling, you know, and their associated provinces. So we'd heard negative reports from, for example, Dalian and from Shenyang in the north, and places like Hefei and Neimenggu and other places already going into this. And we think this economic shock will have huge impact on these cities. And I guess one of the things that we're thinking a lot about now is just how much funding capacity the Chinese government has to address this. I mean, what I find often in most discussions is that it's just assumed that China has unlimited funding capacity for any potential challenge. And our thinking is that that is not the case, that the funding challenges are real. China's revenues have been decreasing, its expenses have been increasing. The central government backstops a huge swath of the Chinese economy. And looking forward, you know, we think it won't be able to do it all. And by and large, the West has given China kudos for exercising restraint about applying stimulus. That appears to be true, but it's one possible explanation may be that the funding isn't there to undertake, you know, a massive sort of stimulus like we saw in the 2008-2009 timeframe. So we're hoping that the NPC will reveal some reporting from the provinces that allow some visibility into the situation in the locales. The cities that are strong are the typical suspects. They're the ones, you know, the provincial capitals and the 4 mega cities, and the cities clustered around them. So in Shanghai, you'll have Wuxi and Nanjing and other places. Outside of those, the situation must be pretty difficult. It would be incredibly interesting to know what the on-the-ground situation is.
Yeah. Chris, is the NPC the right platform for delegates to discuss how the local governments, regional governments, or the central government dealt with the coronavirus fight? And would that be a platform, as it is normally not, to discuss appointments and personnel changes?
Yeah, I think there will be some of that debate, you know, every year, of course. You know, we think once we get past the Premier's government work report, everybody just kind of tunes out really until the end, right? And of course, they do have the meetings with the different delegations, and there'll be some pretty candid discussion, would be my guess. Very little of which is going to see the light of day, you know, I would think, but that it is a good opportunity, and it's an information gathering opportunity for the senior leadership as well. You know, let's not forget that, you know, as David would say, we're not the only ones operating in an information black hole. You know, even the senior leadership is having that problem with some of these things. On personnel appointments, it is actually, you know, every time they convene the NPC, technically they can do it, you know, usually ministerial level changes. I personally am particularly focused on the fact that the public security minister, Zhao Kezer, is 66 years old, and so could easily go. And there's been a lot of interesting stirring of the pot of the legal and security apparatus of recent, and that's quite intentional from Xi Jinping, is my understanding.
Yeah. I mean,
you know, you're just on that to link that growth target. You know, that growth target tends to be an indication of what the credit plan will be for the coming year. And so it's already kind of mid-year, so it's very late, of course. But if the growth target was abandoned, it would make political sense for the central party because it would be achievable, whatever it was. But for the provinces and the locales, it would mean that the credit allocations they could expect would be very uncertain and introduce a new dynamic that you know, we haven't seen before. So it matters. If it happens or not will be a big issue.
Chris, as you're based and presently now in DC, maybe we just move on to US-China. Whenever you think we have reached bottom, there's a new bottom for us waiting. And now, of course, the campaign trial rhetoric will come up. I think a huge impact had the March Pew Research Survey, which showed that 66% of the US citizens view China unfavorably and 60% view them as a major threat. So how much China bashing can we expect until November?
Lots. I think really for the first time, I mean, you know, it's fair to say that China has featured at various levels of prominence in our recent presidential election cycles, and you know, relatively prominently at times. The signal difference, I think, is that in those previous episodes, it was one party or the other doing the bashing, right? And the others maybe less so. This time, I think it's going to be very hard for Vice President Biden to not join in on that. In fact, I was just having a conversation with a senior campaign official the other day, and there's massive arguments already on, you know, you can kind of see the battle lines. The more political advisors like David Axelrod and those guys are saying Biden has missed a huge opportunity to jump on China, and the term of art is apparently collusion between Trump and China, you know, to foist the coronavirus on the United States. And you know, the more sort of dispassionate national security foreign policy advisors are saying, that may not be such a great idea. My sense is they're losing, you know, and so when you combine that debate inside the Biden campaign with a very clear determination, I'm told, from President Trump to let no one get to the right of him on China in this election, it's a bad combination.
Yeah. So how much will the label Beijing Biden stick?
It's performing very well in the trials, I'm told, for a couple of people in the campaign. They got a lot of downloads. I mean, I think that's why there's this sharp debate within the Biden campaign over how much to retaliate. They think they missed a step.
So how's the spiral, David, continuing on this decoupling the tech war that is becoming more and more prominent? How do you see this developing?
Yeah, so our thesis on this is as follows: that that the trade war was encouraging a degree of decoupling, particularly in sensitive technology areas. It wasn't forcing it, but it was encouraging it. The COVID, the supply chain vulnerabilities or fragility that was revealed by the COVID crisis, it will effectively force companies to decouple in order to achieve redundancy. So the key point here is that decoupling doesn't mean exiting China. Companies that have supply chain, most major multinationals have supply chains in China to serve the China market. And we think that these multinationals will invest even more deeply in ring fencing those supply chains that are in China for China and Chinese patron trading nations, if you will. companies that produced in China as a low-cost base for export will move as soon as they can find the scale in other places they need to do so. But most companies that manufacture in a major way are in China for China and will base their supply chain decisions on end market and ecosystem proximity. And in both of those areas, China ranks very highly and will remain a focal location. We don't expect the US government to impose sanctions that will prohibit them from operating in China. That's a very important assumption. And the reason we think that is because it would cause too much economic harm to too many important American and companies. And at this juncture, the US economy, the global economy cannot endure such a, another shock based on policy action. So we don't think the US government will prohibit Western companies from investing in supply chain resources in China. Even in sensitive technology trade, it will continue. Companies on the entity list will require application with the DOC to continue supply. They will continue applying and they will continue supplying. China has requested or has said that any company that doesn't meet its agreed contractual supply commitments will be put on an unreliables list and potentially banned. There's been some high profile cases there, but essentially China is continuing to permit supply, but the costs of this supply, this trade in technology are increasing. And this will maybe force Western companies to localize more, even in terms of their IP portfolio that becomes separate from the US or global portfolio. So again, decoupling is happening. The need to build supply chain redundancy is now even more undeniable. Companies will do that and build supply chain outside of China, but it doesn't mean they will abandon their supply chains that are in China for China. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the European survey, we come out with ours on June 10th, and tellingly, we labeled it Navigating in the Dark, because we have no clue where this is all ending. It's showing that just 10% of companies are considering to move out, whereas 10% are increasing their exposure in China. So there seems to be no, as you pointed, moving out. Some of our customers will, some of our Korean, Taiwanese, and Japanese competitors might, but there's still strong appetite in Europe because given the fact that China has a GDP per capita of Turkey, and if they reach the level of Spain, the economy will be twice the size of the United States. So in a way, for us, it's a no-brainer, but I guess that there will be discussion on some crucial items, pharmacy, for products, for example, to go there. So I was wondering, we have an event next week with Cecilia Malmström, the former commissioner, and she was trying to have allies or a group of like-minded dealing with the challenge, the economic challenge of China. And remember, in Argentina, she signed a paper with the Lighthizer as well as the Japanese counterpart. There is a strong appetite in Europe in order to do something with the US and Japan, but there seems to be no love lost in DC in order to reach out and find some sort of common appetite. How do you see this, Chris?
I think it's being slightly unfair to Lighthizer. I mean, look, he's very much a unilateralist, but I think he gets the bottom lines on these things. And, it's been interesting in terms of the developments of the last few weeks. I was hearing about a month ago that he was, kind of ginning up or very keen on a sort of allies forward supply chain alternative. The trouble, I mean, David nailed it. I thought, the big challenge is take something, out of this crisis that arguably is the most sensitive, right? PPE and medical devices. If you talk to the big four companies here, they'll very quickly say several things. One is that they know that serious congressional investigations will be coming when this all settles down. The word show trial, I've heard, has been dropped a few times. And they know that they need to do something other than the term of art is a China plus one strategy in terms of supply chain base. But then they start looking around and they notice that, strangely enough, Indonesia is small, Malaysia is small, Vietnam's small. It's very difficult to, as David was saying, replace the scale, price, and efficiency of China. So the sense that I have is that on those kind of items, the solution will be much more, okay, let's try for some kind of a halfway house wherein we, operate on much less of a just-in-time supply chain. In other words, warehouse storing of this gear in the home country in very large quantities. That seems to be sort of a workaround that's being thought about because, the last thing, to David's point, the last thing we want, or any company wants, is for Congress to start legislating. It's usually not a good thing. And so they're thinking about ways, but it does show the dilemma. It would be great if the administration would take an allies forward position, but look at something like this cockamamie lab theory. We're losing the Five Eyes partners very clearly. They're leaking all over the place and signaling, sorry guys, not this time. We're not going to get on that train. Whereas it would be very easy, right, to focus on what I call the very inconvenient 6 days in China from the 14th to the 20th of January, where through the actions of some brave Chinese who leaked documents, we know the leadership knew there was a massive contagion, as of the 14th, and they did nothing in terms of telling either their own public or the world. If you want to make a prosecutorial case, for lack of a better term, why not try that on? I think the allies would find that much more palatable. So, one issue is bandwidth as well. Lighthizer is still doing a lot of stuff with Mexico, believe it or not. And there's some nonsense with India, which in my opinion will never go anywhere. And they're trying to make a determination to renegotiate or abrogate the phase one deal. And, that takes up a lot of bandwidth right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for the Europeans, this lab accusation that it comes out of the Wuhan lab has a bit of a taste of 2003, massive weapon of mass destruction in Iraq. So as you rightfully pointed out, I guess there are far better arguments in order to think about how this unleashed this whole disaster. But let me move on to the soft power discussion that's going on. In Europe, China was viewed with great empathy in January. Lots of money came in, lots of help, outpour of emotions. The pictures of singing Wuhan citizens on the balconies really touched all Europeans' hearts. And somehow the wolf warriors managed within a couple of weeks to turn this around and make China extremely unpopular in many countries, particularly the Scandinavian, but also France and also my own country, Germany. So what is driving the propaganda ministry to be so aggressive? What is the political capital that this pack of wolf warriors get in order to bark as loud as they do? Chris.
Right. So I think there's a lot of layers to that cake, but one of them is a phenomenon that started years ago, which is, citizens mailing calcium pills to the foreign ministry, accusing them of having no backbone and things like this. So that trend has been there for a while. But I think the impetus, as we've seen so many times, obviously there are downsides to Xi's consolidation of power and the chairman of everything phenomenon and so on. And, when His Majesty utters something, then, people snap too. So when he tells the diplomats they need more fighting spirit, and, Zhao Lijian, of course, is the godfather of wolf warriors, he's sitting in some horrible place, Pakistan or something, and he's spouting off. Then he gets promoted back to Beijing, to be the deputy spokesman for the foreign ministry, which in that system is no small position. And so I think they're sort of singing the tune. I guess the other thing I would just highlight, because it's a particular bugbear of mine, I worry when we start bandying around terms like global disinformation campaign, because at some level that bespeaks some kind of confidence. I think what we've been seeing, and this is why I think it's such a strong push to your point, is an absolute desperate act to change the narrative. My understanding is she was in direct conversations with Huang Kunming, the propaganda department director, in early March, and really the latter part of February too, saying you've got to change this from China as the origin that foisted this global calamity on the world to something else. You figure it out, and he's sitting there twiddling his thumbs and thinking, God, I'm probably headed to the gallows. And then we have Italy, and then we have the UK, we have ourselves, not exactly covering themselves with glory. And that has given them a lot of room to work on that change of narrative. That the nationalist stuff doesn't work, we all know. I guess one thing, and call me jaded and cynical as all longtime China analysts are, but what happens if China does get its economy, pretty close to full resumption, just as those other economies are coming off lockdown and are desperate, and China's ready to buy? I mean, I think to your point about Europe, it's been an interesting sine curve, hasn't it? It's been sympathy and then anger and then maybe some sympathy again. This is all very transient from my point of view. I think it's going to be a long time before we know the answer.
Yeah. David, you mentioned.
Just building on Chris's point there. I mean, I think like anything in China, there's definitely a confluence of reasons this is happening, but I think possibly preeminent among them was the need to control the domestic narrative, and a disregard, a de-elevation of what damage that domestic narrative inflicted on global public opinion and global geopolitical opinion. Because it does seem to me, and just from what I hear from my contacts on the ground, that the domestic opinion is very much under control. So in one sense, it's been very successful, at least in that regard. So perhaps that explains it, because it really does seem in some ways that it's been inexplicably inexplicably flammable externally. And I think Chris would agree too. The Chinese tend to be pretty subtle in these things, and this seems unusually overt. So I'm thinking about it kind of that way, but who knows?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think this is a very interesting test. I think we can say in the era before 2012, a lot of times when China would make bungles internationally, they would kind of run to the corner, do their 1800 assessments of what went wrong, and then make some sort of change. We haven't seen a lot of assessment and change under Xi Jinping.
No.
And so this is a really critical example, I think, of whether something like that can happen. My instinct is more likely than a postmortem that says, maybe we need to do stuff about information flows and these kind of things these days. It will be a doubling down on all the bad behaviors we've been witnessing, unfortunately.
Yeah, we think of it, we think about it as isolating from the outside and insulating the inside.
And I think David raises a really good point too, which is that we have to always remember the CCP only cares about staying in power and how it's seen domestically. I mean, that's the number one. Foreign policy is like such a distant entity for them.
That's not unlike other countries.
That's true.
Yeah,
but particularly them.
Yeah, of course. To the participants, please start sharing your questions with Jacob, and then we move away from my substandard questions to your more upscale questions. The thing, Chris, I was wondering, in social media since a couple of days, there's floating around a statement which we cannot say if it's fake or if it's real. It's the 14 points of Deng Xiaoping's son, Pu Fang.
Yes.
If that is real, I mean, he's an icon. He's standing in for the big family. How much of a disenchantment do you see of the elite with parts of the leadership of this country?
Oh, I think there's a lot. I call it grumbling, though, because I think a couple of things happened. The one is Xi Jinping has done a couple of things. The first is to completely rewire how power is transmitted and utilized in the system. And that has left a lot of those elites holding the bag. What I find interesting is that, in his princeling arrogance, which I think it's fair to say is true, the only real enemy he sees is another princeling. And not only that, another Hong Ar Dai, right? Which is why Bo Xilai was such a terrible threat, for him. And it's been interesting to watch since he came to power, how slowly but surely he has eviscerated all of those families, the Deng family through the Anbang peace, Chinese son Chen Xiaolu, just run down the list. They're anyone who could kind of fill that role. Pufang has been allowed to kind of do his thing. They have a unique relationship, I'm told. This is not the first time he's fired off a fiery letter. I think there is a lot of disappointment in those communities. The question is, can it translate into something, or is it just grumbling at the end of the day? And, we should never underestimate as well. I was told a narrative by a very good contact that I think resonates in this. This is another sort of Hong Ar Dai family, very liberal one. And, they were heard to remark, we don't like everything he does, but at the end of the day, the party must stay in power. And there was remarked that his genius was to make himself the party, which therefore makes him very difficult to criticize.
Yeah. Jacob, do we have good questions? No? All right, may I just move on, because David, you're located at the tail end of the South China Seas in Singapore. This kind of assertiveness, the kind of pushiness of the Chinese foreign policy, at the same time, the kind of dependence of Southeast Asia on the Chinese economy. How's the mood in Southeast Asia right now? And where do you see this going?
Gosh, I mean, we're all under lockdown, Joerg, so we don't really know. I mean, the mood is hard to gauge, but clearly Southeast Asia is very concerned about the escalation of U.S.-China tensions and the animus that is emerging, even hateful diatribes. So, the Premier Li Xianlong here in Singapore has said that when you're a small mouse dance, I think it was something like a small mouse on the dance floor between two raging elephants, you just have to be very careful, something to that extent. And I think Asia is a little bit mortified at this juncture about the escalation of tensions, at least rhetorically, and whether or not this will force some decisions longer term. So I think in general, Southeast Asia has been trying to navigate or thread a needle here and not have to choose sides. And it may be increasingly difficult for them to do so. I do think that the policy platform that is being promoted by Assistant Secretary Stilwell on the notion of a pluralistic Asia policy is pretty intelligent, and there is some resonance, and it's seen as being moderate and logical. So there's some resonance there. But as of now, I think the situation in Southeast Asia is middle of the crisis, and people are really focused on that more than anything else.
Yeah. Okay, Jacob.
All right, we have a question from Jens Eskelund. With some analysts estimating real unemployment standing at about 20%, how high will unemployment be on the agenda of the NPC? And to what extent will it change the social contract between the CCP and the population?
Yeah, that's a good one. I know where that comes from, Jens, but this is really the main zone of risk for China's economy. The employment data, the labor data in China are particularly tricky. And up until just 10 years ago or so, they were considered neibu. It was a national secret to know the situation clearly there. But the NBS does now have a survey, and it showed that in the January, February period, employment shot up to a record high of 6.2%, and it has come down a little bit in March. But this only will survey registered urban hukou holders, so it doesn't count migrant labor, and it certainly doesn't count anybody who is furloughed, i.e. not working but also not laid off. And we think if you add up the different components, you get to a number that's quite big, not quite as high as 20%, but something in the low teens, 14, 15%, which is a huge number. We're talking sort of 120 million Chinese people. Then you have roughly 8.5 million new graduates entering the labor market this summer. It's a big challenge. It's always been the big challenge. How will this change? I've always found China, insofar as it's a socialist country, even communist purportedly, it's the most libertarian place I've ever witnessed, where almost any individual doesn't rely on the government at all. They know they have to kind of look after their own. They have to look after their family. They have to find work. They have to work hard. And they often say, they can chirku very effectively. And I think we'll see that. But again, this is one of those areas where the information is the most murky and the visibility is the least, and it's really the most important question. Again, we think that the chances of large-scale protest or unrest are probably pretty limited for the not right reasons, but this is going to be a major source of tension, and I think it would explain why the narrative about China's triumph over this virus is so important. It's the most important, and how the international community perceives it is much less important.
Maybe just building on Jens' questions, is there going to be anything substantial coming out of the NPC that helps foreign business? Is there any going to be, because there are so many warm words on, we have to open up. The chamber has been subject to a charm offensive, which rarely happens. And so there are all these kind of signs of, we want more foreign investment. At the same time, for example, to stay in the shipping area where Jens is working, we know about a paper that sort of encourages Chinese exporters to go from FOB contracts to CIF, meaning that they decide which shipping airlines they're going to use and not the buyer in Europe anymore, which of course leads to the thought that possibly a Chinese shipping company will be chosen. So there is all this talk about opening up, and then you come across these small little needles that indicate exactly the wrong direction. So what do you think will the NPC do in order to actually you put some teeth into the kind of opening up theory?
I mean, I'll offer a few things. I don't think it's going to do much, probably. I guess, I see this one very much like the Wolf Warrior problem. This is a unique opportunity for China to demonstrate that it means something when it makes endless comments about supporting FDI and encouraging FDI. And, Premier Li has certainly been on this run, since this happened. And even Xi Jinping has been very careful. I mean, even when they were at the darkest period of what largely is a domestic crisis and issue, both of them were tucking into remarks the need to protect global supply chains and support FDI and so on. But where are the policies? That's the question. It has been somewhat encouraging. You have small steps like the recent new ordinance that came out on factors of production. Right now, I mean, that's something that was entrained from the third plenum. I'm told Liu He was particularly passionate about that one the whole time, and they finally got it over the wire. So, there's bits and pieces, but it's hard to see certainly things that might benefit U.S. companies. I'm not so sure right now.
Yeah, I think we I remember during the 80s China when I was first there, it was a time when the market wasn't very open to foreign investment, and yet we used to say things like, uh, nothing is permissible, but anything is possible. And that strikes me as where we are kind of with China today. The written regulations aren't necessarily overtly favorable to foreign business, but the conditions underneath have become incredibly favorable by virtue of the economic stress that China is now under, that is amplified by the geopolitical pressure. So our feeling is that when it is precisely when China is facing the most stress that the value proposition for foreign investors is the highest as the purveyors of quality investment, employment, tax revenues, CSR, and so forth, and that this is such a time. Furthermore, back to my point about funding capacity, we don't think the Chinese government has the ability to backstop everyone here. And so we expect many Chinese competitors with weak balance sheets who are not of strategic interest to the party will be forced out of the market. I don't know if you saw this little news blurb in February about Xiaomi introducing a new phone that they actually called the Apple killer, the iPhone killer. And at the same time they announced the phone, it was revealed that they had applied for a 5.8 billion RMB loan to take the phone to market, which of course caused an uproar in the social media circles, and Xiaomi backed away from it. But this is a good example of a company that has a weak balance sheet and may not be one of those supported. I'm afraid that in the telecom space with a company like Huawei, national security interests will see that company supported. The same would probably be true for some of the big shippers like Costco in the example you just raised. But I think in many other sectors, we will see consolidation occur because it can't be stopped, and that this may even result in more favorable market conditions for many foreign players in the market.
Jacob?
All right, we have a question from Agnes regarding your comments on China's mask diplomacy and sort of the wolf warrior diplomacy going into Europe. You mentioned that China was unusually aggressive in this round of propaganda, which actually has generated more negative sentiments. What can China do better after it's kind of got a grip on this crisis? And how can it find a way to kind of create a more positive message and a positive relationship with Europe?
Is that towards me or David? David and Chris, maybe you chip in, and then I see
Sure.
if I can add a European angle to it.
Yeah, no, that would be good. I think they've had a very mixed bag of results in their approach, but they still have opportunities. David would be smarter on this than I, but it strikes me that we're going to have a series of emerging market countries that are going to have some kind of a financial crisis, that comes out of this situation. And China has the money, to be helpful. I mean, one thing I found striking is that in some recent conversations, I'm told that there's a lot of buzz, trying to work its way up to the leadership about, remember 97, when everyone thought we would devalue and we didn't, and we got 10 years plus worth of soft power bang from that, adventure. I'm deeply skeptical they'll be smart enough to see the wisdom of that. And unfortunately, their highly transactional selves make these things very, very challenging. I think in Europe, the best thing they can do is just shut up, I hate to be so blunt, but that would really help.
Yes, David?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to be disparaging around the program overall. I think actual facts about the percentage of, how many conditions were wrapped around these donations, and whether the quality was there or not there. I just find that it's very hard to ground any interpretation in strong facts. You know, I don't know. I expect that there were cases where there was, you know, severe ulterior motive and shoddy stuff, but there were probably a lot more cases where the gifts were generally more genuinely philanthropic. So again, there's just too much noise here to know what the truth is, in my view.
Yeah, from my observation, I think the problem that we have with China is that they are very often viewing the world as a zero-sum game. If they win, the others have to lose, or at least look bad. And that's a great pity because, again, January has really proven that Europe cares for China. The outpour of help, 2 billion masks were exported into China. And at the same time, China was going the extra mile to make sure that European companies, as well as European governments, basically lay low in the kind of efforts they undertook in order to help China. So there was no flag raising, there was no kissing anything at the receiving end or at the departing end. And then next thing, the tide is changing, and all of a sudden you see that there is massive propaganda celebrating 50,000 or 100,000 masks going to some countries, going along with this kind of, you guys, you can't help yourself, we help you. And that was irritating, to say the least, in the capitals of Europe, and also with a couple of people. So that actually was surprising and came on top of these irritants, at least to the big countries, on 17+1. You know, why does China carve out 12 from the European Union and chip in 5 that don't belong there? And of course, the awareness that Belt and Road maybe will not be as advantageous than it was. And then, of course, the kind of language which you would never expect from a European diplomat in Beijing to say, you know, the French put away old people so they can die faster. So that's unprecedented. So I really, I mean, to wrap it up, I would really say, like Chris, just shut up.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's kind of important to note that, you know, a lot of that messaging, for whatever reason, you know, I don't think it came from the highest levels of the Chinese leadership. You know, it was at a kind of a mysteriously lower level. You know, again, it's unusually overt and antagonistic. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something which is creating a whirlpool. Again, I mean, the base load was having great respect, admiration actually for the people of China, in particular the guys in Wuhan, how they endured this hardship and fighting at the same time then having diplomats undoing this positive image. There is the other thing that maybe before Jacob has another question is, it is striking in Europe when Europe was coming up with the idea of raising money 2 weeks ago, that the heads of government all said, we're going to pledge it and we're going to do this video conference on this one. And then last minute, Li Keqiang dropped out and was replaced by Ambassador Zhang Ming. Something impossible here. Just imagine if Chancellor Merkel pulls out and sends in the German ambassador as a substitute. So in a way, that's sort of like, so how much is China really engaged and willing? And to David's point, does China have the money in order to support this kind of bailouts of countries that are in distress, the kind of G20 pledge in order to, you know, cut debt, haircut, and so forth? Does China have the money to proceed with Belt and Road as it possibly needs the money more here in the domestic circles? For David and Chris.
Do you want to start with that, Chris?
Yes,
or?
yes.
So let me get off mute there. You know, I mean, my sense is that the money can be found. You know, I mean, the reality, one thing I find striking, I mean, one of the things I'm most eager to see, David mentioned it just as I was joining the call, coming out of the MPC is, what are they going to do with the fiscal deficit cap? Because you can make a case that, you know, taking it from, what was it, 2.8 last year to arguably maybe 3.5 this year or something like that, that's nothing. You know, there's plenty of room in theory. So there's some systemic element that, you know, kind of prevents them from doing that. So it would be interesting in my mind to know, you know, sort of more about what the constraints are there. I'll be honest, you know, if you look at BRI, for example, as a program, I mean, if the government wants to push something, they can tell the policy banks, you know, and they've done this over the last 6 to 8 years, you know, okay, well, you're a social financing arm of the government. Okay, great. We don't really like that. We want to be a bank. Okay, we'll be a bank. And then Xi Jinping comes in and they say, no, you're a social financing arm of the government again. So, you know, if they want to push it, you know, they can print money too. You know, what I think, so my point is, I think the limitations are far more on their just general approach to life on some of this stuff than it is fiscal or monetary constraints. That's just my view.
Yeah, well, you know that. Yeah, I agree completely. I think what's difficult is that they can't print U.S. dollars, and you know, we suspect that there's a lot. At least we don't think so. But
Give them time.
Yeah. Yes. But you know, in 2019, the errors and omissions on the capital account flows were higher than ever. So we suspect that there's tremendous capital outflow pressure. Also, you know, the trade data that we saw in March and April don't jibe with the recipient country import data in major ways. So the reported trade surpluses are in our view suspect. And then, you know, we've never had a good view about just how much of the FX reserve there is, and much less how much of it is liquid versus illiquid, like, you know, loans to Venezuela that are never going to be recovered. I mean, and then these assets that China has acquired that we've all suspected vis-a-vis economic viability, like the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka. I mean, these cost real money to operate, and I have always marveled in how frugal China is with FX outlays. Wherever it might be. Now, domestically, printing money, you know, seems, I mean, it's just a fait accompli. It happens and no sum is too great. But if it's actual money, there's a lot of resistance to actually giving that up by all actors involved. So I think that's going to become a big constraint. And maybe you could corroborate this, Chris, because you'd probably be closer to it than I am. But we heard lots of rumors last year and the year before, as economic pressure was building in China, that there was a pretty substantial voice in the domestic polity that, you know, China shouldn't be wasting resources overseas. It should be applying these to you know, just like we have in America today in some quarters, you know, to supporting Chinese development and not external development. But I think there's a lot of pressure on the program from the finance side.
Agree with all the above. Yep.
Jacob?
All right, we have a question from Douglas Dew. How do you think the COVID-19 outbreak is likely to impact the soft power of both China and the US in the coming years? I assume he's talking about the outbreak itself and then the subsequent performances of these two countries. Oh, and additionally, how will it potentially impact the dynamics of the Thucydides trap?
I don't know. Don't get me started on the Thucydides trap, but
yeah.
Bad history and bad analysis. But you know, I think the fundamental thing is China just sucks at soft power, you know, and they have for a very long time. I mean, you know, this goes back to when Hu Jintao was around, and this is when they were just getting started in Africa. You know, they had a foreign affairs work conference in 2006, I believe, or 2007. The sole purpose of which was him calling everybody together, and that included SOE managers, provincial level people, and saying, you guys are causing complete chaos with your, sort of coordinated actions down in Africa. We've got, ZANU-PF saying we're a colonialist power, things like this. It's very hard, for them to hear. So that's been going on for a while, and it's just very difficult for them, I think, to give something without expecting something in return, to David's point earlier. And I think the other issue is that they're determining that soft power as a non-democratic government and the innate legitimacy that imbues a country with, which then allows them to stretch, in these areas. It's hard, they're trying to find ways to expand their influence in international organizations and so on without being democratic, and I think they're finding it hard. On the US, I think this has been the most massive fumble, certainly since the global financial crisis, for US credibility and soft power. There's not a lot left from my point of view. Thank goodness, even when they don't want us, they still want us, because for reasons unknown. But I think that it's been exceptionally damaging how badly we bungled this.
Well, yeah, and on that soft power point, it doesn't tend to emanate from, the high echelons of government. I mean, it can. I mean, I would say the White House had a tremendous opportunity to turn much of this positive, as did China's top leadership, but that didn't happen. Both administrations seem overly concerned about domestic politics, and that is guiding the rhetoric and the narratives and the dynamics. But underneath it all, what companies do matters, and what happens in the cultural sphere. So I think that U.S. companies tend to undertake a lot of action at times like these, and the same is true for European companies, and the reports around CSR and contributions in China at the height of the crisis are manifold, and I think do influence public opinion in a massive way. And we see that reflected in the recovery of iconic Western brands as China's consumer economy begins to reflate a little bit. I share Chris's view on the Thucydides trap. Our view is that the source of this tension emanates from a systemic conflict more than anything else, that you have a competition of systems, the Western capitalist market system and the Chinese state capitalist system, and the two systems have strengths and weaknesses. This is no judgment on either, really, but fundamentally they don't play well together, and there are things that need to be resolved for them to be able to do so. We've talked about the reciprocity issue, for example, and so on and so forth. But we don't see a Thucydides trap dynamic playing out here. We see a competition of systems dynamic, and it is massive and important and difficult. And it will either lead us to more separation or more integration. We don't really know which way it will trend, but even in the worst case scenario, a separation scenario, this doesn't mean that multinational companies, European or America, will exit China necessarily, but it does mean that they will need to dichotomize almost or adapt with very distinct and separate China presences versus what they look like in the rest of the world.
Maybe from my own observation on Europe, when I started getting engaged with China in the 80s, 90s, and so forth, even after 1989 Tiananmen, China had tremendous soft power in Europe, in particular in Germany.
Certainly because we had lots of Chinese restaurants, Chinese neighbors who were wonderful, hardworking, non-political. So actually the moment, ironically, when China started spending money on soft power, that when it sort of started going wrong, the kind of assertiveness that came with that. So it seems to be the toolbox on how to do this is the problem. And again, I think there is perception of Chinese and Chinese products in Europe is actually excellent. I mean, after all, we buy €1 billion of Chinese products every day. So, I mean, if you look into a recent survey by Bertelsmann, 50% say that, yes, we have common economic interests, but when it comes to common values, political interests, there's a huge gulf in how Europe views the US, still favorably, believe it or not, and very skeptical of China. 50% of Germans view China as a major competitor, and whereas nearly 40% think we share the same political interests with the United States. So there's still some love in the Atlantic relationship, despite all the noises that's going on. The most interesting part where Europe objects to China is digitalization and data protection. 6% of Europeans trust a Chinese company to handle data responsibly, whereas 20% feel like the Americans would do this. And of course, the rest is we are better off with European companies. So that just shows that actually we have a downward spiral going on in Europe, driven also by this assertiveness. And you can sense it in this yellow press. In particular in Germany, we have rants going on Bild Zeitung and others, anti-Chinese, and of course that influence our electorate, which then influences basically the top leadership in Europe that normally also my country is pro-China, because we know what China is worth it when it comes to engagement on climate change and economic cooperation. But the next question goes to Jacob.
All right, we have a question from my predecessor at the European Chamber, Lance Noble. How do you think about the evolving outlook for alignment between China and Russia on global governance and strategic issues?
I'll take a stab at that one.
Yeah, please.
I think, and hi Lance, good to hear from you. You know, I think the crisis is bringing them even closer together. That seems pretty clear. They've had each other's back, I think, all throughout the crisis, despite what should have been, and I think was behind the scenes, a serious test when all the Chinese started flooding for you know, Far Eastern Russia and trying to come in through Heilongjiang, and they had a huge outbreak and it became very problematic. And the Chinese are penning people in on the Russian side and so on. I mean, that had a real potential to be a problem. I think the one thing that always strikes me though with it is that Putin and Xi give this vibe of, you know, it's a deep and trusting and all good relationship. And I think between the two of them, it is. If you speak to anyone in either system below their level, they're deeply skeptical and suspicious, probably more on the Russian side, even so, than on the Chinese side. So, you know, there are always going to be limits. I think one of the biggest challenges is that the Chinese have become decidedly and publicly comfortable with casting themselves as the big brother in the relationship. You know, Putin has to eat that because he doesn't really have a choice. But it does rankle him and others in the system. But I definitely think that this, and especially the sharper turn again in the US, and then of course we have a presidential election coming up where there are already allegations of Chinese behavior that looks a lot more like Russian behavior for 2016. Some of that's overblown in terms of the scale, but the specific incidents I think are powerful. And, you know, yet another measure of different things that China never had done before and now they're doing. And we see this particularly on their intelligence side where they look, you know, much more like the KGB than the MSS of old.
And you another one? No. Well, you possibly know Clive Hamilton in Australia. He came out with a book 2 or 3 years ago that sort of showed the influence that China
has undertaken in order to influence Australian decision makers. Now, Clive and a German researcher, Mareike, came out with a book yesterday, which was broadly reviewed in the German media. It will come out in English in September or August, I guess, indicating the kind of influence China takes in Europe. As you can imagine, given what Clive has been doing in Australia, this book is not really favorable to China. There seems to be a real discussion going on. How much do we have to push back on this kind of PR offensive and the kind of influence seeking that China indicates? I mean, recently in Europe, as you know, the Commission came up with a paper, and there was these rumors that it has been pressured by China in order to be a bit more accommodating. And last week, this disastrous China Daily article, where China Daily decided to take out the reference in a very soft and engaging article from all the European ambassadors here, the reference to Wuhan, which then caused a lot of discussions in Europe. So in a way, what do you think is we came back to this one. What do you think is the kind of backlash in the US, for example, where you're more familiar with, or Southeast Asia, concerning Chinese assertiveness? And to Chris, if, say, Joe Biden is going to win the elections, what's going to be different?
Yeah. Let's tackle that latter one first, because I think it's the easiest. All I can say is my understanding is, especially from the deeply left-leaning wing of the Democrat Party, Vice President Biden has been under tremendous pressure to publicly come out and call all of this racist. The Wuhan virus piece and Pompeo's comments and the like. He has steadfastly refused to do so because he's a politician. So, I do think things will be different, but they'll be different in degree, not in, vector or scale, or however you want to put it. As to, the broader issues, I admit sometimes my logic brain is not my best friend. When I sit down and see these things, if I'm a university and I take Chinese money and I let them shape the line of the coursework and so on, shame on me, right? If I am a local newspaper and I feel or a national newspaper that feels it's okay to have a China Daily insert to generate revenue, which is clearly a propaganda sheet, and anyone working at those journals knows it, shame on me, right? I mean, there's a lot of ways where if you have any awareness and some chutzpah, these things are fairly easy to deflect. I maybe it's me, but I can tell you this. When I was in the U.S. government, we spent very little time worrying about the United Frontward Department and its activities, and a lot more time worrying about institutions in China with actual game.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think this often gets, a whole bunch of issues get lumped into one bucket here. It's not unusual for a country to use its geoeconomic power to influence policy, to influence, markets and commercial arrangements in its favor. And China has an amazing toolkit. It has domestic market access that it can turn up or turn down or off or on. It has a huge production base where lots of foreign companies have put incredibly large capital footprints, not to mention our gracious host. It has huge financial resources that it can dedicate to development. And and the U.S. uses similar levers, and the Gulf states use similar levers to fund their airports and their airlines and their access routes to Europe and so forth. That's not unusual. What is unusual are the very extreme things China will do to control the narrative or public opinion or even the behavior of ethnic Chinese people or influence them abroad. Chris and I are both graduates of UC San Diego, and a few years ago they had the Dalai Lama at their commencement speech, and the Chinese student unions activated at the university, and not only there, but everywhere, almost everywhere, in opposition to this. And I began to think, like, what would happen at Beida or Tsinghua if a group of American, Liu Xuesheng in those places organized a protest? Can you imagine? It's unthinkable. Even so. Anyway, I won't go there. But the, kind of the extreme irony is kind, but I would say even hypocrisy of those types of activities really don't help China. I wish that would end. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it works against Chinese interests, but I find it just astonishing how attentive the United Front will be towards, minuscule reports.
Yes.
Insecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jacob?
We have from Dennis Taganoff. In regards to the phase one deal, China promised to buy around $200 billion of US products in 2020 and 2021. In fact, the numbers so far show that Chinese imports from the US have decreased. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the trade agreements?
Not a lot of good.
Great. Yeah, great if you could take this one. I know your colleague, Scott Kennedy, has published some work on it, but it looks like it's really short.
Yeah, no, he has. He's doing great work on this stuff. I think it's pretty clear. It depends on how you break it down. If on ag, they're holding their own. They're going to be short probably of the goal, but they're sort of doing something. On manufactured goods, it's not happening. On energy, if anything, they're taking advantage of low oil prices to buy more from Saudi and from Russia. And then there's tone, which is very important. And despite a somewhat mystifying, from my point of view, series of releases by both USTR and Liu He's office, that these calls are going swimmingly, at all these different levels, that's not my impression. And especially more so at the working level, the so-called designated officials level discussions, where actual, commitments in the agreement and so on are raised. I think it's fair to say, even without any U.S. glasses on, that the Chinese have been variously and simultaneously evasive, smug, and just downright unhelpful. And, that means that I worry about a period that I used to think might be in like August or September, but that may now be June or July, where you have a whole coalition of forces coming together. Trump is getting, daily briefings from Lighthizer that they're not doing their end. A lot of this is politics. I think the Trump's comments about, I'm not sure about the deal, it's all nonsense. He's just using this as bluster and leverage, I think. But it doesn't mean he won't be volatile. The period from May to August of last year should be highly instructive on this. And what's striking, because the point David was making a few moments ago, the Chinese, instead of doing their usual thing of sort of just being quiet and hoping to ride it out, they're ginning up Global Times to say, well, maybe we'll pull out before you can, these sort of things. So it's delicate and it's interesting. And this is why I mentioned in my sort of earlier comments, I don't think it's status quo. It's renegotiate or abrogate. That's the pathway we're on.
Yeah. David?
I guess a big question there is whether we'll see, if it's abrogated, will we see the White House impose the additional tariffs?
Almost certainly.
But this is going to tank Wall Street.
Oh, big time.
Monstrous implications. So, will they actually undertake that at this juncture?
It's very hard to say. Logic should dictate otherwise, but Trump's mind is more often that of a casino operator than someone who actually understands Wall Street. And his view is, we've got a pile of chips. the market's going crazy. That gives me the room to do what I did again last year. He just doesn't get it about, the broader economic fundamentals not being there. I mean, this is my impression from, I find that the people who understand him best are the few contacts I have that aren't in the government, but do know him really well from New York, and we're fellow property barons with him and so on. They understand his psyche. They may not understand all the policy issues, but they understand his psyche very well. I worry about a real combination of his feeling vulnerable that then turns to volatile in the coming 2 to 3 months. It's very worrisome for me.
We're coming to the end of our session. You know that I want to pick your brain. Jacob and myself, we have to come up with an executive summary on our position paper. As you know, this is our Bible, 400 pages, and we have to sort of come up with a coherent narrative. And the two of us are thinking about doing something on 14th five-year plan. Now, of course, we hope that the NPC comes up with some indications of where China might go in the planning for the next 14th five-year plan. Is there anything you expect in NPC related to 14th five-year plan? And if not, still, what kind of ideas could you give Jacob and myself to draft something sensible in our position paper?
I'm not sure we'll see much out of the NPC on it. I mean, it's very challenging now, right? Because the previous series of plenum cycles and how they functioned has been kind of thrown out the window, in this current central committee. So obviously in normal times we would be, and the drafting is happening, and it's definitely happening, and they're pretty far down the track is my understanding. Mm-hmm. I've only heard whispers. David may know more. I think we should expect to see a lot of Made in China 2025 under a different name, with an emphasis on thinking about ways that we can maintain those same efforts whilst taking some of the state-led aspect out of it and trying to grapple with the inefficiencies that a program like Made in China 2025 in a Chinese system tends to generate. I mean, I've heard this repeatedly from Liu He and his team. They don't dislike the policy of Made in China 2025. They do dislike the waste. So, there's that aspect.
Yeah, and again, it's amazing how irrelevant it seems these five-year plans have become. They've really kind of been superseded today by the mega plans, whether it's Greater Bay Area or Made in China 2025 or Belt and Road or Jingjingji. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think we'll see it sort of wrap around those. I don't expect a deviation in this sort of regional specialization concept. So Guizhou for cloud computing and so on and so forth. But I think we'll see budget allocations to the new infrastructure plan. And, I've already heard that, the investments are being approved in kind of record number for new STEM industrial parks. And it's always unbelievable to me how many industrial parks can be built. So the idea is you build the road, the facility, the buildings, the bridges, the surrounding real estate, but then how do you actually get STEM business in there and attract, scientists and business? So I think we're going to see another big spending spree on parks related to new infrastructure. I don't know if it will be specified as such, but that's what it will be in practice.
I think that's right. And to your point, David, you just look at a project like Lingang, right, in Shanghai, you can see, even in a major metropolitan setup like that is so difficult.
Or
and also you see how dependent they are on foreign direct investment to build those parks as well. That's really important.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, what I heard in the Chemical Association is that there will be very strong emphasis on environmental development. And of course, it will be interesting to watch if ecology is being beaten by economy, given the coronavirus and the possible demand shock that we're going to face here. So that's going to be interesting.
Guys, you have done really well. Thank you so much. Good night to you, Chris, and have a wonderful day in Singapore, David. And thank you for all of you for joining in.
Thanks for listening to our webinar Playback series. We hope you enjoyed the content and that you're eager to listen to the rest of the episodes. Thanks as well to our guests, Chamber President Joerg Wuttke, and my colleagues Zhang Yichi and Gao Rui for handling the editing and content on the back end. This has been Jacob Gunter at China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Thanks for listening.